Recently, I made a video where I discussed stuff that have been removed from Pokemon games that I think they should bring back, which gave me the thought that it would also be fun to talk about the opposite. So here is some stuff from every Pokemon generation that I would remove from the games. Starting with Gen 1, I have one that I think most people would welcome seeing it removed, and that is version-exclusive Pokemon. The original games introduced this concept, and while it did help to grow Pokemon's success at the time, in the current modern-day games, I think it is time to do away with it in its current incarnation. This is something that we have actually seen slowly happen over time, where less Pokemon have become exclusive and those Pokemon have been made available in their opposite version via events and other special means, so that you're not strictly limited to having to trade for them. If it was up to me though, the way that I would handle the concept of version exclusives is by making those Pokemon uncatchable in the wild, but they would become gift or reward Pokemon instead, where they are given to you for completing various tasks and side quests throughout the game. Those kinds of Pokemon are always super fun to get whenever you kinda stumble upon them, and turning those Pokemon into version exclusives would not only make them accessible in their opposite game, but it would still preserve their exclusivity to a degree as well, and it would actually make them fun to obtain instead of frustrating. The age-old idea of having to trade for these Pokemon in order to get them though, with no other possible method of obtaining them, I would definitely do away with. When looking at Gen 2, it introduced a lot of cool stuff, and in my opinion, there isn't really anything about Johto's introductions to the franchise that leaves a sour taste in my mouth. So I opted to go with a certain someone who I've never really been a fan of from this generation, and that is Sunflora. Sunflora has always been generally unpopular, and I bring it up in particular not only because it's just a sunflower with a face, but because Gen 2 is iconic at this point for all of the cut content that we know about it. We know about a ton of cut Johto Pokemon, and it honestly is just baffling that all of those Pokemon were cut, while a sunflower with a face was deemed good enough to actually be put into the games. I know that there is more to that process than just the Pokemon designs, but I mean, come on, the logic here is a bit suspect. Sunflora also isn't really one of those iconic Johto Pokemon that people look back on fondly, so with the exception of probably a few people, I don't think cutting Sunflora out of the games would really hurt most people all that much either. For Gen 3, I've got something pretty spicy, but before we get to that, I would like to give a big shout out to today's sponsor, Dave. Dave is a great help in making these videos possible, and they can also help you when you need a little support as well. You never know what life is going to throw at you these days, which is why it is always nice to have a financial cushion if you can, and Dave is the banking app that's leveling the financial playing field. When you download Dave, you can get up to $500 in 5 minutes or less. No credit check, no late fees. It's part of Dave's Extra Cash account. Advance the money when you need with no interest, and then settle up later. Basically, Dave helps you to get money when you need it instead of having to wait for your paycheck at the end of the week. So if that sounds like something that would interest you, you can download Dave today at dave.com/hoops. That's dave.com/hoops. You could get up to $500 in 5 minutes or less when you download Dave. No credit check, no late fees. Download the Dave app now or go to dave.com/hoops. For terms and conditions, go to dave.com/legal. Eligibility criteria and instant transfer fees apply. Banking services provided by Evolve, member FDIC. And again, a big thank you to Dave for supporting the channel. For Gen 3, I have something that is going to ruffle some feathers, so I would also like to say that I have an explanation for it, so hear me out. If it was totally my choice to take something out of the Hoenn games, I would remove the Battle Frontier, with one caveat. I wouldn't just take it out for no reason, but I would instead do what Oraz did and take it out to essentially make room for some Delta episode-like content instead. In Oraz, that is essentially the trade-off we got, and while many people were upset that the Battle Frontier wasn't included in those games, personally, I would take stuff like the Delta episode over the Battle Frontier any day of the week. So if that's what it takes to get more content like that, I would welcome removing the Battle Frontier from the games. I do like it as a post-game area and a legitimate piece of post-game content that adds cool stuff to do and it adds new characters to meet and all that kind of stuff, but in general, I have never really been a battle facility guy. Taking out the ability to earn money or experience for my Pokemon in those battles just kills any point in me taking part in that kind of thing, and story content like the Delta episode is infinitely cooler in my opinion. So while I wouldn't just get rid of the Battle Frontier for no reason, I would definitely get rid of it for the right price. My pick for Gen 4 kinda relates back to what I just said about Generation 3, because if I were to remove something from this generation, it would be contests. I was originally going to have contests be my pick for Gen 3, but I think they're more deserving to be removed from Gen 4 instead, because here, they're even more of an afterthought. Contests are something that were introduced in Gen 3, so they made a splash there and they had their place as an interesting new mechanic, but they also weren't particularly groundbreaking or really worthy of being carried over to multiple generations in my opinion. So them being in Gen 4, I personally couldn't really care less about. There were way too many other new things introduced in Sinnoh that had my attention at that point for me to care about the return of a feature from the previous games that I didn't really care that much about at the time anyway. They're also all the more in the background in the Sinnoh games because of this, so to me it just feels like the kind of thing that the Sinnoh games could do without and be totally fine. I'm sure there are some contest fans out there who don't feel the same, but that is personally what I would do. Gen 5 brings us back to a classic discussion within this generation that will probably go on until the end of time, no matter how much people grow to love Unova, and that concerns Unova's new Pokémon. On pretty much every level, Gen 5 introduced some amazing stuff, but the new Pokémon, which is also the biggest new content of any new Pokémon game, largely fell flat for a lot of people, at least at the time. These days, people are much more receptive to Unova, but people kind of hated all of its new Pokémon when they were new, and I was honestly a part of that group. While I don't really mind the idea of only having new Pokemon to use and actually think that's kinda cool, it was this idea that gave us the huge amount of new Pokemon we got in Gen 5, which ultimately feels like we ended up getting a quantity over quality type situation with the new Pokemon. So I personally would have just cut back on that and focused on making sure that Unova has good new Pokemon to offer instead of just new Pokemon, because that really does make or break the experience of the games for a lot of people. Quickly skimming through the Unova decks, there are about 40 Pokemon that I personally could easily get rid of, which still leaves a little over 100 new Pokemon to still be in the games, which not only would have still been a great number to introduce, but the reception to them would have undoubtedly been a lot better without so many stinkers in the Unova decks. Obviously, they did need those numbers to be able to just have new Pokemon in the game, and in the end, it did work out because people love Unova now, but I feel like Unova could have still stood to benefit from a trimming of its new Pokemon. Arriving at Gen 6, there was one thing that came to mind for me pretty quickly with this generation when exploring this concept, and that is O-Powers. On the surface, O-Powers are actually pretty cool because they offer different effects that can benefit you in a bunch of cool ways, like allowing eggs to hatch faster, getting more prize money from battles, and increasing the amount of experience your Pokemon gain from battles. When you put it that way, O-Powers actually sound amazing. However, the way they were distributed completely ruined them, at least for me. O-Powers are given to you by a guy named Mr. Bonding, and the way that he gives them to you is creepy to say the least. I legitimately didn't even use O-Powers when playing through X and Y just because the whole process of getting them was so weird, and after a couple of times, I just stopped talking to Mr. Bonding altogether. And due to the reputation that this guy has in the community, I know that I'm probably not alone in that sentiment. If they would have just been normal about integrating this feature, it could have been way cooler, but due to the creepy factor of it, I personally am going to eliminate it. For Gen 7, I have a pretty big thing that I would remove from the games, and that is the Island Challenge. It's basically the central feature of the entire Alola games, as it takes the place of the traditional gym system, but honestly, I just want gyms. I feel like Alola in general is somewhat divisive in terms of people's opinions on the games, and I feel like a big part of that is the Island Challenge. It's just a bit too atypical to what I personally like and want out of a Pokemon game, and while I think Sun and Moon are still good games, I think in the long run, the Island Challenge does detract from them a bit. One thing that communicates this to me big time is the Trial Captains. The Trial Captains are essentially equivalent to gym leaders, except you don't battle them or interact with them in the same way, so they don't really make the same impact. And therefore, I feel like the Trial Captains are generally seen as less iconic or aren't remembered as fondly as gym leaders are. For instance, if Mallow was just a regular gym leader, I feel like she would be considered an all-time great. But because she's a trial captain, people don't really care about her as much. Overall, the whole Island Challenge thing I feel like was a replacement that wasn't as good or better than the thing that it was replacing, which was the gym system, and personally, I would have liked to have just had gyms instead. Meanwhile, Gen 8 basically did a flip of what happened in Gen 7, where they brought back gyms, but decided to go without an Elite Four, which Gen 7 did still have even though it didn't have gym leaders. An Elite Four in Galar was replaced in favor of an anime-style Pokemon League tournament, in order to fall in line with the more sporty vibe of the Galar Pokemon League. However, with the way that ultimately went, I would have just preferred a regular Elite Four. While the tournament was neat, just re-battling a bunch of trainers that I had already battled previously made it somewhat forgettable as well, and it removed the excitement of being introduced to new, powerful trainers like the Elite Four offers. If it were me, I would have had the Tournament of the Galar League feature 4 battles that take place against at least 2 or 3 new trainers, so that there is still kind of an Elite Four element to it, where you're facing off against brand new trainers that you've never met before. Only battling people that I had already met and battled before took away most of the excitement for me and kinda just made it feel like a retread versus a completely new experience at the climax of the game, which is obviously pretty important at that stage. So I would have just preferred a normal Elite Four instead. And last but not least, for Gen 9, I have something that is tied more to my personal experience than anything else, so don't feel bad if you feel differently, but I personally didn't really care about the concept of sandwiches. I did enjoy the storyline aspect of how Koraidon and Miraidon loved sandwiches, but as a game mechanic, I personally just didn't really care. They have similar effects to what I mentioned with O-Powers before, and are also similar to making curry and poffins from previous games, but I personally just am not really interested in making a sandwich when I could be out exploring the open world that they put in this game, or finding the new Pokemon, or progressing through the story. As a gameplay element, it just didn't really grab me. And like with O-Powers, I could have got way more invested if the gameplay side of things was a little more interesting, considering that the effects that they offer are actually pretty substantial. Like, even if they kept the concept of sandwich making, but instead turned it into a more traditional cooking and crafting system, like with Breath of the Wild, for instance, where it's all done on the fly and you don't have to stop everything you're doing to just make a sandwich and can just pick up ingredients and make the sandwiches as you go, then I could have got more into it. And going forward, I think that is the way that I would like to see Game Freak implement this kind of mechanic in future titles. Now that I have said what I would get rid of though, it's time to let me know what you would remove from the Pokemon games. Let me know with a comment and leave a like if you enjoyed the video and subscribe for more. You can also check me out on Patreon if you would like to further support the channel, which is super duper appreciated. And until the next video, as always, thank you guys so much for watching this one. I really appreciate it, and I will smell you guys later.